June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. Before dawn, the world is still asleep. The channel is cloaked in fog so thick it swallows the horizon. A faint drizzle kisses the sand. Along the bluffs of Omaha Beach, German sentries of the 352nd Infantry Division scan the water through mist-fogged binoculars. Nothing moves. No sound except the steady hiss of the tide. To them, this stretch of coastline seems lifeless, unremarkable. The sea, flat as glass, reflects a gray sky that carries no hint of invasion. Some soldiers sip coffee in bunkers carved into the cliffside. Others lean against cold steel, yawning, their rifles slung low. Hours earlier, reports had spoken of strange radar echoes across the channel, but those were dismissed as British tricks. Then, from somewhere beyond the fog, a low vibration begins to roll through the ground. It grows, a deep mechanical hum spreading beneath their boots. The sentries squint into the mist. A faint shape appears, then another, then hundreds. The water itself seems to come alive. The Allied Armada, over 5,000 ships strong, is emerging from the gray. The beach the Germans thought was empty is about to roar to life. By early 1944, Europe had been under Nazi occupation for nearly 5 years. From the streets of Paris to the fjords of Norway, Hitler's banners hung heavy over a continent carved by fear. But behind that iron facade, the Axis war machine was beginning to crack. The Soviet Union was pushing west with relentless force, reclaiming scorched cities from the ruins of Stalingrad and Kursk. In the south, Allied armies had already landed in Italy, fighting their way toward Rome. The last great step, the decisive blow, would come from the west. It would require crossing the English Channel, a treacherous strip of sea that had defeated armies for centuries. The plan was as audacious as it was impossible, an invasion so vast, so complex, that failure would mean not just defeat, but the prolonging of the war for years. Hitler had anticipated this. In 1942, he had ordered the construction of the Atlantic Wall, a 2,400-mile fortress of bunkers, minefields, barbed wire, and artillery, stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. Tens of thousands of conscripted laborers poured concrete into the cliffs, while German engineers filled the beaches with deadly obstacles, metal crosses, mines, and stakes meant to tear apart landing craft before they ever reached shore. To the German High Command, Normandy was a lesser concern. The most direct route to France lay across the Strait of Dover, toward Calais. There, the English coast was closest to France, barely 20 miles apart. That was where the Germans stationed their heaviest defenses, convinced it would be the main Allied entry point. Normandy, by comparison, seemed unlikely. Shallow tides, unpredictable weather, and poor harbors made it a logistical nightmare. And yet, from London to Portsmouth, the Allies were preparing a deception of unimaginable scale. Under the codename Operation Bodyguard, British intelligence and the newly formed American OSS began to weave a web of illusions. Fake radio traffic, inflatable tanks, dummy aircraft, even a phantom army under General George S. Patton. This ghost force, stationed in southeast England, was meant to convince Hitler that the invasion would strike Calais. The deception worked. Even in early June, as Allied bombers darkened the skies over northern France, Hitler's generals remained fixated on Calais. When reports surfaced of troop concentrations in southern England, the German 15th Army stayed frozen in place, waiting for an attack that would never come. Meanwhile, across the Channel, hundreds of thousands of men waited. On England's southern coast, soldiers from the United States, Britain, and Canada filled the camps and harbors. They were young, most barely 20, but their task was ancient, to storm a beach under fire and carve a foothold in enemy territory. On June 4th, bad weather swept in. Gale winds and pounding rain. The invasion was postponed. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, under enormous pressure, walked alone into the storm the following night. If the weather didn't clear, the invasion would be delayed for weeks, risking exposure, leaks, and the collapse of morale. But at 9:45 p.m. on June 5th, meteorologists reported a brief window of calm. Eisenhower gave the order. 2 words sealed the fate of thousands. Okay, let's go. As night fell, the largest armada in human history began to move, a dark tide of steel and men pushing toward the French coast. Over 150,000 troops aboard 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft set sail into the gray dawn of June 6th, and waiting on the opposite shore, the German sentries still saw nothing. The calm before Omaha was almost over. In early June 1944, the German chain of command in France was a web of divided authority. At its head stood Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the seasoned commander responsible for the entire Western Front. Beneath him, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, oversaw Army Group B, including the critical coastline of northern France. Both men were experienced, capable, and skeptical of Hitler's strategic rigidity. Yet even they disagreed on how best to defend against the inevitable Allied invasion. Rommel believed the only chance of victory lay in crushing the enemy on the beaches before they could establish a foothold. Rundstedt, however, favored a flexible defense, holding armored divisions inland to counterattack once the landing zones were clear. The result was paralysis. Hitler, who fancied himself a military genius, refused to commit fully to either plan. He placed reserve panzer divisions under his direct control, far from the coast and impossible to move without his explicit permission. When D-Day arrived, that fatal indecision would become the Allies' greatest advantage. The deception plan, Operation Fortitude, continued to mislead German intelligence until the very last hours. Radio operators in Kent transmitted false chatter about troop movements near Dover. A network of double agents, including Britain's famous Garbo, fed Berlin convincing reports of an impending assault on Calais. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over southern England photographed endless rows of tanks and landing craft that, in truth, were nothing but rubber decoys. Even on the eve of the invasion, Rommel remained certain the Allies would strike at Calais. He had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday and to plead with Hitler for more resources. By the time word reached his staff that the real invasion had begun, Rommel was hundreds of miles away, at Omaha Beach. The German defenses were manned primarily by the 352nd Infantry Division, a seasoned formation recently transferred from the Eastern Front. Its soldiers were a mix of veterans and teenage conscripts, led by determined officers who had spent months preparing their positions. The division's sector stretched along 20 miles of coastline, from Vierville-sur-Mer to Colville, a narrow corridor of cliffs and open beaches backed by farmland. The terrain itself was a fortress. Unlike other beaches designated for invasion, Omaha rose sharply into steep bluffs. Behind the sand lay open fields offering no cover. From above, German bunkers and machine gun nests commanded perfect lines of fire. They were built to slaughter. Each position was interconnected by trenches and tunnels with overlapping arcs of fire. Mortar pits were hidden among hedgerows. 88mm guns, the fearsome dual-purpose weapons capable of tearing through tanks or infantry alike, were concealed in concrete casemates. Anti-tank obstacles, stakes, and mines filled the shallow water. Even without a single soldier firing, the terrain itself was death's ally. For days, the Germans had watched Allied bombers hammer the coastline. But the damage was deceptive. Many bunkers remained intact, buried deep in concrete and earth. The beach obstacles, thousands of them, stood waiting like the ribs of a steel beast beneath the tide. Shortly after midnight on June 6th, paratroopers from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began dropping inland, far behind German lines. Their mission was chaos: to seize bridges, cut roads, and block reinforcements. Many missed their targets. Entire units were scattered across miles of countryside. Yet even this confusion worked in the Allies' favor. German headquarters struggled to understand the scale or direction of the attack. At 3 a.m., radar stations along the French coast began detecting a mass of echoes moving across the channel. At first, operators assumed it was another false reading, a phantom trace like so many before. But soon the reality could no longer be ignored. The channel was alive with ships, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft, a wall of steel advancing through the fog. Messages flew across German command posts, but confusion reigned. Without Hitler's authorization, the panzer divisions could not move. At Omaha, the men of the 352nd remained at their posts, peering into the darkness. By 4:30 a.m., the Allied fleet took its positions. Hundreds of warships aligned offshore, their guns ready. The sea was calm again, unnaturally so. A gray stillness hung over the horizon. To the men in the bunkers, it felt like the eye of a storm. Then at 5:45 a.m., the silence shattered. Allied battleships opened fire, shaking the coast with thunder. The air filled with the howl of shells and the smell of burning powder. The sky turned to flame. Omaha Beach was awake, and within minutes, thousands of soldiers would step into that fire. When the first light touched the gray horizon, the men in the landing craft could finally see the coast of France. A pale, jagged line beneath a low ceiling of smoke. The sea was rough. Waves slammed into the flat-bottomed boats, sending cold salt water over helmets and rifles. Many soldiers were already seasick, shivering in their gear, gripping their weapons in silence. Inside each craft were 30 men, packed shoulder to shoulder, faces pale, eyes fixed forward. Most had never seen combat. They came from small towns in Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania, told they would be part of something that would end the war. Few believed they would survive the hour ahead. As the engines roared and the spray stung their faces, they could smell the cordite from naval guns firing miles ahead. Some whispered prayers. Others stared blankly at the steel ramp in front of them, the thin wall separating life from death. Corporal Francis K. Langford of the 116th Infantry later wrote that he had never felt such silence between men. Nobody said a word. It was like the whole boat knew it was going to die together. On the cliffs above, the German soldiers were waking from their unease. Some had dozed through the night, believing the shelling was just another Allied diversion. But as the fog thinned, they saw what lay before them. Hundreds of landing craft racing toward the beach. The water was alive with motion. An officer shouted orders. Machine guns were uncovered. Ammunition belts fed into the MG-42s, the fastest automatic weapons of the war. Their barrels gleamed under the morning light. Within minutes, each bunker came alive with movement, soldiers rushing to firing slits, loading grenades, checking sights. The illusion of an empty beach vanished in an instant. At 6:30 a.m., the ramps of the first landing craft crashed open. The men stepped into chest-deep water and were cut down within seconds. Machine gun fire swept through the surf like scythes. Those who stumbled fell instantly. The tide turned red. Helmets floated. Rifles sank. The sand offered no cover. In the chaos, leadership dissolved. Platoons lost their officers in the first minute. The survivors crawled forward, clinging to anything. A steel obstacle, a corpse, a crater, just to breathe another second. Yet through that horror, men kept moving. Not in formation, not in command, just driven by instinct and the will to live. It was humanity stripped bare. Omaha Beach was never meant to be conquered easily. Stretching for roughly 6 miles between Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville, it was flanked by steep bluffs rising up to 150 feet. The tide receded nearly half a mile at low water, exposing flat open sand. Perfect killing ground. The Germans had chosen this terrain carefully. Their 352nd Infantry Division transformed it into a web of overlapping fire zones. From the cliffs, they could strike every inch of the beach. Artillery positions further inland were zeroed to known distances, calibrated for precise, devastating fire. Each bunker was numbered, each gun coordinated. The machine gun nests, Widerstands nester or resistance nest, were arranged in tiers. When one opened fire, another could cover its blind spot. Mines and barbed wire funneled attackers into narrow lanes where overlapping fire would tear them apart. Even if the Allies reached the sand, they would face another barrier, the bluffs themselves. The slopes were steep and exposed, dotted with mines and snipers' holes. It was a defense designed not just to repel, but to annihilate. The Allied planners knew Omaha would be hard, but they underestimated how much harder. The pre-invasion bombardment, though massive, failed to destroy the German positions. Bombs fell too far inland. The naval guns fired too short. When the first wave of American troops landed, most of the bunkers were untouched, fully manned, fully armed, and waiting. The German MG-42s fired at a blistering rate of 200 rounds per minute. In the first 15 minutes, entire units were shredded before they could reach cover. Communication broke down. Radios were drowned, wires cut, officers killed. The beach became a graveyard of broken equipment and men. Yet amidst this slaughter, small groups began to adapt. Soldiers crawled under fire, using smoke and shell craters as cover. Engineers cleared mines by hand. Some used Bangalore torpedoes to blast through barbed wire, opening narrow passages. Inch by inch they began to fight the terrain itself, and the odds that had been designed to kill them. Far from the beach, aboard the USS Ancon, General Omar Bradley watched through binoculars as smoke rose from Omaha. Reports were scattered, confused, terrifying. Entire companies were missing. Radio transmissions were filled with static and screams. By 7:30 a.m., Bradley feared the landing might fail entirely. He considered halting further waves, diverting reinforcements elsewhere. But then came fragments of reports, snippets of hope. Small groups breaching the wire, scattered men reaching the base of the cliffs, isolated bunkers going silent one by one. Leadership at Omaha didn't come from the top. It came from the bottom. Sergeants, corporals, even privates took command where officers fell. Small acts of initiative, a smoke grenade, a flank through a ditch, a grenade tossed through a firing slit, began to change the tide. On the German side, confusion also spread. Their communication lines were jammed. Their artillery observers couldn't see through the smoke. The beaches below looked like chaos, yet, in that chaos, American resolve was growing. By 8:30 a.m., the German commanders realized something terrifying. Despite the carnage, the Americans were not retreating. They were regrouping, reorganizing, crawling up the bluffs. The sound of MG-42s continued to echo, but for the first time that morning, their rhythm began to falter. The beach was no longer silent prey. It was fighting back. Behind the human courage and chaos of D-Day lay an unprecedented feat of engineering. Every piece of metal, every machine that crossed the channel represented years of desperate innovation. The Allies had turned science into survival. At the heart of the invasion were the landing craft, vehicle personnel, the LCVPs, small, flat-bottomed boats built by Andrew Higgins in Louisiana. They were crude, loud, and brutally efficient. Each could carry 36 men, drop a steel ramp, and deliver soldiers straight onto hostile sand. Eisenhower would later call them the boat that won the war. Around them churned a sea of specialized vessels, UKW amphibious trucks, DD tanks with canvas skirts that allowed them to swim, and bulldozers fitted for demolition work. The plan was for these floating tanks to provide immediate cover on the beach, but the sea had its own will. At Omaha, rough waves capsized many before they ever reached land. Dozens sank, taking crews and equipment to the bottom. Those that survived the surf faced German shells the moment they appeared. Technology gave the Allies an edge, but not immunity. Radios jammed. Mines detonated unpredictably. Navigation errors scattered the landing waves. What had looked flawless on maps dissolved into chaos under fire, and yet that same technology, crude, improvised, imperfect, became the backbone of adaptation. Engineers with flamethrowers cleared bunkers. Demolition teams wired explosives around anti-tank obstacles, blasting open paths for reinforcements. Naval gunners aboard offshore destroyers recalibrated their guns and began firing almost point-blank into German positions to save the men on the beach. Every piece of machinery, every innovation had been born from necessity. D-Day was not just a battle of courage. It was the triumph of logistics and engineering under impossible pressure. For the Germans, Omaha was not supposed to be a battlefield of legend. It was supposed to be another quiet sector, one of many under the vast Atlantic Wall. In the early hours of June 6th, the 352nd Infantry Division was stretched thin, roughly 12,000 men spread across miles of coastline. Their commander, General Dietrich Kreis, had been awakened in the night by reports of paratroopers inland. Believing it to be a diversion, he hesitated to move his reserves. When the true scale of the assault became clear, it was already too late. The German soldiers on the bluffs, many just 18 or 19 years old, fought with grim discipline. Their machine guns never stopped, even as shells ripped their positions apart. They had no air cover, no naval support, and no expectation of reinforcement. Yet they held their ground for hours, firing until the barrels of their MG-42s glowed red. Inside the bunkers, the noise was beyond comprehension. The shriek of shells, the concussion of near misses, the acrid smoke filling the air. German medics scrambled to treat the wounded in cramped concrete chambers lit only by muzzle flashes. For them, Omaha was not a massacre of enemies. It was survival, They were defending a world order they barely understood, following orders from a command already blinded by arrogance and deception. By mid-morning, crisis men were fighting isolated battles, each bunker commander making his own decisions. Some refused to surrender, others retreated to secondary positions. What had begun as a coordinated defense was unraveling into desperate resistance. When the first American troops broke through the wire and reached the cliff bases, German machine gunners began to realize what was coming. Their fields of fire were narrowing. Ammunition was running low, and the Americans were climbing. In the decades since D-Day, Omaha Beach has often been remembered in numbers. 34,000 troops landed, 2,400 casualties, 6 miles of coastline. But numbers cannot speak of what it meant to live through that morning. For those who fought, morality was stripped to its bones. It wasn't about ideology, patriotism, or vengeance. It was about inches of ground, moments of life. Men carried wounded comrades under fire, knowing they would likely die for it. Medics worked on the sand with no cover, marked only by a red cross that the bullets did not respect. There was no glory in Omaha. There was only endurance. For the German defenders, the moral line was equally blurred. They were fighting to survive, not for a cause they chose. Many were conscripts, Austrians, Poles, even Russians, drafted into Wehrmacht service. The idea of enemy became distorted in the smoke and blood. When the shooting stopped, some German soldiers surrendered in tears, shaking hands with the same men they had tried to kill hours earlier. Others lay dead in their positions, clutching weapons they never had a chance to reload. For the Americans, the beach became sacred ground, not because of victory, but because of sacrifice. Bodies lay in rows along the tide line, boots half buried in the sand. Priests moved among them, whispering last rites. The sea, which had delivered them to hell, began to carry the fallen back out to its depths. Omaha's lesson was not just military, it was human. The invasion was proof of what ordinary men could endure, and what they must sometimes become to change the course of history. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift. The smoke thinned, revealing a beach littered with wreckage, fire, and the faint movement of soldiers crawling upward. Above them loomed the cliffs, their final barrier. The Germans believed they still held the high ground. But beneath the haze, hundreds of Americans were beginning to climb, and in those next few hours, the fate of D-Days and the Western Front would be decided. The early hours of June 6, 1944 were dark and bitterly cold. The English Channel churned beneath thousands of ships, destroyers, landing craft, transports, each packed with men staring into the black horizon. They were silent, many whispering prayers or gripping photographs of loved ones. The code name was Operation Overlord. For months it had been a shadow, a whisper in war rooms. Now it was about to erupt into one of the bloodiest battles in human history. As the first light of dawn crept over the gray water, German sentries atop the Normandy cliffs saw faint outlines moving across the horizon. Through binoculars, the scene seemed unreal, an entire armada stretching as far as the eye could see. At 5:30 a.m., naval guns thundered to life. The sky lit up with explosions, streaks of fire, and trails of smoke. The calm waters of Omaha Beach vanished under a storm of steel, but the bombardment did not break the German defenses. Many bunkers survived intact, their concrete walls shielding machine gunners and mortar crews. When the landing craft doors dropped, American soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions charged forward into chaos. They expected the beach to be softened by shelling. Instead, they found it untouched. An open killing ground, the tide was against them. The water rose quickly, swallowing obstacles and mines. Many men were forced to wade through waist-deep water under relentless fire. Machine guns from Widerstands Nest 62 and other strong points cut through the first waves. Soldiers fell before they reached the shore. The sea turned red. Communications broke down. Radios drowned, officers were killed, and units became scattered. Tanks meant to support the assault. D.D. Sherman amphibious tanks were launched too early. Most sank beneath the rough waves before reaching land. Only a handful made it ashore, and even they struggled to find footing on the shifting sand. Every few meters forward was paid for with blood. Medics worked under fire, dragging the wounded into shallow craters. Commanders shouted orders that could barely be heard over the screams and explosions. The beach was a nightmare of smoke, debris, and confusion. General Omar Bradley, watching from the command ship Augusta, feared the worst. Reports coming in were grim. Whole companies pinned down, thousands of casualties within the first hour. The thought crossed his mind. We might have to evacuate Omaha. But there was no turning back. At that same moment, on the cliffs overlooking the beach, German Major Werner Plosskat peered through his rangefinder. He could scarcely believe what he saw. Despite the slaughter, the Americans were still coming. Every wave brought more men, more determination. For every soldier who fell, another took his place. By mid-morning, small groups began to organize. Captains, lieutenants, even sergeants took command where officers had died. Men from different companies banded together. Crawling through the surf and over the bodies of their fallen comrades, they reached the base of the cliffs, wet, exhausted, terrified but alive. They found cover behind steel obstacles and the shattered remains of landing craft. Engineers carrying explosives through gunfire began blowing gaps in the German wire. The smoke and chaos became an unexpected ally. The defenders couldn't see clearly who was moving where. Then came the moment that changed the battle. Around 9 a.m., a small group of soldiers led by First Lieutenant John Spaulding and Sergeant Philip Strechik from the 116th Regiment found a path through the bluffs near Colleville-sur-Mer. They began climbing, hand over hand, clutching mud and rock, bullets whizzing past their heads. Above them, the German machine gunners shifted targets, momentarily distracted by naval bombardment. When the first Americans reached the top, they took the defenders by surprise. Grenades cleared the trench lines. Within minutes, the first German position fell. This breach created a spark of hope. Word spread quickly down the line. We're up the cliffs. From that moment, momentum began to shift. More soldiers poured through the openings. By noon, dozens of small penetrations along the beach began to link up. Machine gun nests that had ruled the shoreline were suddenly attacked from behind. The iron defense of Omaha began to crumble from within. Still, the cost was horrific. By 1 p.m., more than 2,000 Americans were dead or wounded. But against every odd, the impossible beachhead had been secured. On the German side, confusion spread. Communications were failing and reinforcements were too far inland. Commanders hesitated, believing Omaha was just a diversion for a larger landing at Pas-de-Calais. That hesitation sealed their fate. What began as near-certain disaster was slowly turning into one of the most courageous victories in military history. And as the tide turned once again, this time in favor of the Allies, the meaning of Omaha Beach was rewritten not in orders or maps, but in human endurance. The soldiers who survived that climb now faced the next challenge, pushing inland before nightfall, into a countryside brimming with more resistance. By the early afternoon of June 6, 1944, the horror of Omaha had begun to shift into momentum. What had once seemed like certain annihilation was now turning into a fragile but unstoppable advance. Small, scattered groups of Americans, once pinned to the sand, were now climbing through hedgerows and breaking into the open French countryside. Behind them, the beach was still a graveyard. Smoke, wreckage, and the bodies of men who had never reached the cliffs. But above it, on the bluffs overlooking the channel, the tide of battle had changed hands. As the engineers detonated, the final obstacles and cleared exit, routes known as E1 draw and D3 draw tanks, began to rumble off landing craft and onto the blood-soaked shore. They were few in number, but their arrival symbolized something greater. The beachhead had held. The surviving infantry pushed inland through the ruins of the first German trenches. Many of the defenders were still dazed from the relentless bombardment. Bunkers once spitting fire were now filled with silence, shattered concrete, and the smell of cordite. Surrendering soldiers emerged with trembling hands, their uniforms blackened with soot and dust. By mid-afternoon, units from the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, had reached the outskirts of Vierzeville-sur-Mer and Colville, while the 29th Division fought bitterly near Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. Each village was defended by remnants of the German 352nd Infantry Division, men who had fought tenaciously, but were now overwhelmed by the sheer persistence of the invaders. The fighting was not just brutal, it was personal. In narrow lanes between hedgerows and across farm fields, combat turned to close quarters. Grenades, bayonets, and rifles replaced the long-range duels of artillery. Smoke grenades mixed with the stench of diesel and blood. Every wall, every ditch was contested ground. On one side of a crumbling stone wall, American troops huddled, exhausted, out of ammunition. On the other, a handful of German defenders, some barely 18 years old, prepared for their final stand. There was no communication, no mercy, only survival. By 3 p.m., American naval guns resumed bombardment further inland, targeting German positions preparing counterattacks. Destroyers such as the USS Carmack and USS McCook sailed dangerously close to shore, sometimes within 1,000 yards, to fire directly into cliffside bunkers. Their guns thundered at near point-blank range, shaking the very earth beneath the soldiers' boots. These actions saved countless lives. Every precise shell that struck a pillbox silenced another machine gun that could have stopped the advance. For many, the image of these destroyers, so close that soldiers could see the faces of their crews, became a symbol of salvation. Meanwhile, General Jarrow, commanding the V Corps, received the long-awaited signal: Omaha secure enough for reinforcements. It was not complete control, but it was enough to move forward. The beachhead was alive. Farther inland, chaos consumed the German command. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man responsible for the Atlantic Wall defenses, was away in Germany attending his wife's birthday. His absence left a void of authority. Conflicting orders delayed the movement of armored reserves, the Panzer Lehr Division and 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, which could have countered the beachhead. By the time Hitler himself was informed of the invasion, it was already late morning. Convinced that Normandy was a diversion, he refused to release his reserve division stationed near Pas-de-Calais. The crucial hours were lost. Back on Omaha, the battle's rhythm had changed. Instead of being hunted, the Americans were now the hunters. Platoons swept through trenches, tossing grenades and clearing bunkers one by one. A few German snipers held out stubbornly in the ruins, their rifles echoing from hidden windows. But the inevitability of defeat was spreading. By 5 p.m., roughly 34,000 American troops had landed at Omaha. Reinforcements poured in steadily. Engineers, medics, artillery crews, all stepping over wreckage that only hours earlier had seemed like the end of the Allied dream. The German 352nd Division, once confident in its defenses, was now broken. Out of its 7,800 men, over 2,000 were dead, wounded, or captured. Commander General Kreis, realizing his lines were collapsing, ordered a retreat inland to regroup. As the sun began to set over the Normandy coast, Omaha Beach, once a symbol of death and failure, had become the foundation of the Allied invasion. The beach was littered with wreckage, bodies, and smoke, but above the carnage stood something new, a foothold in Fortress Europe. The Americans had done what many believed impossible. They had breached Hitler's Atlantic Wall, the largest defensive system ever built. But it had come at a price so high it defied imagination. And as night fell over the blood-stained sands, the sound of distant gunfire echoed into the hills. The invasion was far from over. Beyond the beach lay the hedgerow country of Normandy, a labyrinth of fields, ambushes and villages that would cost thousands more lives to claim. But for now, on this single stretch of beach, the impossible had been achieved. Omaha had been taken, and from that narrow victory, the liberation of Europe had finally begun. The smoke over Normandy had not yet cleared. But the scale of what happened that day was already being measured by commanders, soldiers, and survivors alike. What came next would determine whether this beachhead would hold or fall under German counterattack. When dawn broke on June 7, 1944, the first full light revealed the true face of Omaha Beach. The sea was calm again, but the shoreline looked like the aftermath of an ancient catastrophe. Landing craft lay twisted in the surf. Smoke still rose from burnt-out tanks, and bodies, American and German, drifted in with the tide. The sand, once golden, was dark with blood and debris. For the men who survived, the horror of the previous day had not yet faded. Exhausted, hungry, and numb, they dug foxholes at the base of the bluffs, preparing for a counterattack that never came. Medics moved quietly among the wounded, marking the living from the dead. Priests whispered final prayers over fallen soldiers. Every face carried the same expression: relief that they were alive and disbelief at the cost. By midday, engineers had cleared the first proper road off the beach. Bulldozers, brought ashore under fire the day before, pushed wreckage aside to create lanes for trucks, jeeps, and tanks. The once deadly landscape was transforming into a supply artery. Behind the lines, ships began unloading crates of ammunition, rations, and fuel. Omaha was no longer just a battlefield, it was becoming a bridgehead. In the command tents on the bluff, American officers reviewed reports. The casualty lists were staggering. Of the roughly 34,000 troops who landed on Omaha, nearly 2,400 were killed, wounded, or missing. Some regiments, like the 116th Infantry, had lost entire companies within minutes of landing. Yet despite the devastation, the line had held. The bridgehead connected with the British at Gold Beach to the east and the Americans at Utah to the west. The dream of a united front across Normandy was becoming reality. Across the Channel in England, news of the invasion spread through radio bulletins and whispered headlines. At first, reports were cautious. Words like heavy resistance and difficult conditions masked the scale of what had happened. But when confirmation came that the Allies had secured all 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the mood changed. Church bells rang across London and the BBC declared, "The invasion of Europe has begun." For the Germans, the shock was equally profound. In the ruins of the 352nd Infantry Division, survivors retreated inland toward Bayeux and Caen, struggling to regroup. Many were disoriented, still unable to comprehend how the Americans had breached what had been deemed an impregnable wall. Hitler, furious and incredulous, demanded counterattacks at once. But the Luftwaffe could not gain control of the skies, and the panzers were already pinned down by Allied air power. Meanwhile, in the Allied camp, officers walked the beach in silence. Among them was General Omar Bradley, who had watched the battle unfold in dread from the USS Augusta the previous day. Now, as he stepped onto the sand, he saw the carnage firsthand. He later wrote, "The seawall at Omaha was a charnel house. It was the loneliest walk I ever took. Yet within the destruction lay victory. The blood spilled at Omaha had purchased a path into the heart of Nazi-occupied France. Within days, American reinforcements were flooding ashore. The 2nd and 29th Divisions, engineers, medics, and logistics units. Roads were laid, artillery emplacements built, and command posts established. By June 9th, more than 100,000 Allied soldiers were fighting inland, linking all beachheads into a single, expanding front. Still, the cost weighed heavily on every man who stood there. The names of the dead were written hastily in field notebooks, their bodies marked with simple crosses of wood. The sound of waves breaking on the shore seemed almost mocking. Gentle, indifferent, eternal. The Germans would later call Omaha the graveyard of the brave. To the Americans, it became something else, a symbol of what human will could endure. And as the last of the wrecked landing craft were dragged from the surf, and the beach turned once again into a highway of men and machines, one question hung over every soldier who survived that day. Had it been worth it? Because just beyond the beach, another kind of war awaited. One fought not across open sand, but through hedgerows, villages, and ambushes that would test them in ways even Omaha had not. The battle for Omaha had ended, but the campaign for Normandy was only beginning. By the second week of June 1944, the beach that had once been a killing ground was now a vast, organized machine of war. Rows of vehicles stretched inland. Convoys of trucks unloaded supplies day and night, and makeshift field hospitals treated a ceaseless flow of wounded. The transformation was astonishing. Where craters and barbed wire had once ruled, engineers now built roads, communications lines, and ammunition depots. Piers made of floating pontoons, known as mulberries, allowed cargo ships to unload directly onto the beach. The Allies were constructing, piece by piece, the foundation of their liberation force. Every few hours, new waves of men arrived. Reinforcements from the 2nd Infantry Division and 9th Armored Division landed with fresh equipment, joining those who had survived the horror of D-Day. Among them walked young replacements staring in silence at the burned wrecks of tanks and landing craft, still half buried in the sand. Omaha was a reminder that victory in Europe would demand everything. For the American command, the focus shifted inland, to the tangled hedgerows and winding lanes of the Normandy countryside. These fields, enclosed by thick earthen walls and vegetation, became deadly traps. German snipers and machine gunners turned each corner into an ambush. Progress slowed to a crawl. The men who had endured the beach now faced a new nightmare, the Battle of the Bocage. Every advance was measured in yards, every village captured at enormous cost. Rain turned the roads into rivers of mud. Artillery echoed day and night. The invasion had succeeded, but the liberation of France was proving far from simple. Still, morale held firm. The beachhead was secure, the enemy pushed back, and Allied air superiority dominated the skies. Supply lines stretched from England to Normandy like arteries feeding a living force, and through it all, Omaha stood as both a warning and an inspiration. For the families back home, the first telegrams began to arrive. Mothers, fathers, wives, and children opened the pale yellow envelopes that began with the words, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you." Each one represented a son, husband, or brother who had given his life on that strip of sand. In many towns across America, church bells tolled quietly and flags were lowered to half-mast. Yet amid grief came pride. Newspapers published stories of courage, men who charged machine gun nests, medics who carried the wounded under fire, engineers who disarmed mines while bullets struck around them. Omaha Beach became a legend almost overnight, spoken with reverence across the free world. In Germany, the mood was starkly different. Reports from Normandy spoke of disaster. Hitler's promise of an impenetrable Atlantic wall had been shattered. The myth of Nazi invincibility was fading. Civilians whispered of the invasion's meaning. It was the beginning of the end. Within months, the Allies would break out from Normandy, liberate Paris, and push toward the Rhine. But even victory could not erase the memory of Omaha. Journalists visiting in the days after the battle described a haunting scene. Rows of simple white crosses marking temporary graves, the air still heavy with the smell of gunpowder and salt. The soldiers who buried their comrades did so with quiet ceremony, often using their helmets to scoop sand over the fallen. Later, these makeshift cemeteries would become part of the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial at Colleville-sur-Mer, a vast resting place overlooking the very beach they had fought for. More than 9,300 American soldiers lie there today, their graves aligned in perfect rows under the French sky. For survivors, Omaha was not a story of glory, but of endurance. Many spoke little of it afterward. To them, it was not the beach itself that mattered, but the brotherhood forged in that impossible hour, the men who refused to yield even when everything seemed lost. The cost had been almost beyond comprehension. But without Omaha, the road to Paris and eventually to Berlin would have remained closed. And as the tides of the Channel continued their endless rhythm, washing over the same sands where history had been written in blood, the meaning of Omaha Beach endured. It was no longer just a place. It was a promise that freedom, however costly, could be won. The guns had quieted, the land was secured, and the world was forever changed. But to understand what Omaha truly meant, to history and to humanity, one must look beyond the statistics and the strategy, and see the deeper reflection it left on those who fought there. Omaha Beach was more than a battlefield. It was a crucible of the human spirit. Every inch of that blood-soaked sand told a story of fear, duty, and unrelenting resolve. For the soldiers who waded through the surf under gunfire, the world became reduced to one desperate truth: either move forward or die where you stood, and yet they moved. Historians would later calculate the odds, dissect the strategy, and trace the lines of command that shaped the outcome. But the truth of Omaha cannot be measured in plans or maps. It lived in the heartbeat of every man who crawled through the tide, in the silence after each explosion, in the way ordinary soldiers performed extraordinary acts simply because there was no one else left to do them. The victory at Omaha opened the door to the liberation of Europe. Without it, there would have been no march on Paris, no crossing of the Rhine, no fall of Berlin. The war in the West turned on that single strip of coastline, yet its legacy reaches far beyond military triumph. It became a mirror reflecting both the cost and necessity of freedom. Standing today on the cliffs above Omaha, the wind still carries the same salt air that once mixed with smoke and fear. The sea below is calm again, its surface giving no hint of the chaos it once held. Across the manicured rows of white crosses at Colleville-sur-Mer, the sound of the waves rises and falls like a quiet requiem, a hymn to courage, sacrifice, and endurance. The men who died there were not seeking glory. Most were young, frightened, and far from home. But in facing the impossible, They did something eternal. They turned despair into determination, and defeat into victory. Omaha Beach remains not only a place of remembrance but a lesson that even in humanity's darkest hours, courage can light the way forward, and as the tide continues to wash over those shores, it whispers the same truth that history has carried ever since June 6, 1944. Freedom endures because brave men refuse to fall back.